In our first two episodes, we have discussed George Marshall's beginnings in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. In today's story, we will see him leave his hometown for a much broader world and for experiences that would take him far away from his simple life as a boy. Although Marshall didn't seem destined for greatness, his brother Stuart had distinguished himself at the Virginia Military Institute, and George Marshall wanted to go there too. He was especially determined to do so when he overheard that brother tell his mom that she shouldn't let him apply. He told her that George would surely ruin the family's reputation with his poor academic showing. And Marshall later said, "Well, that made more impression on me than all instructors or parental pressure or anything else. I decided right then that I was going to wipe his eye." And then he said, with some satisfaction, "I did finally get ahead of what my brother had done." The urgency to succeed, though, he said, came from hearing that conversation. It had a psychological effect on my career. Marshall entered as a freshman at V.M.I. in 1897. With his son's admission check, George's father included a note to V.M.I. Superintendent Scott Shipp. "I send you my youngest and last. He is bright, full of life, and I believe he will get along well." And although Marshall continued to struggle academically, he did get along well. At V.M.I., Marshall took to the order and discipline of military drill there. However, his experiences as a fourth-class rat were difficult. For his first year at V.M.I., Marshall had arrived late. That was because he was recovering from a very serious bout of typhoid. At V.M.I., freshmen are called fourths, sophomores are thirds, juniors are seconds, and finally seniors are firsts. Because of his lateness, Marshall, as a rat, ended up in the barracks of thirds in room 88. Now, thirds, who were not that long past from their own rat experiences, were very harsh on the newbie fourths. And here they had one of their own in their own space. So Marshall had been in residence only a few weeks when he was required to squat over a naked bayonet as a test of his endurance. And still weak from typhoid, he could not hold out long. He slipped and was gashed in the buttocks. Marshall told no one about this, but medical documents from sickbay indicate that he was excused from drill for several days. How Marshall explained what had happened to those in authority, we don't know. What we do know is that he did not tell. However, things did get easier for Marshall. Hazing was not allowed, so these particular cadets were so scared of possible punishment that they gave room 88 a hazing bypass for the rest of the time. Marshall seemed to accept the rigors of that life, the hazing by the upperclassmen, the discipline of it, and he simply said it was part of the business. Marshall scholar Larry Bland noted that throughout his life, Marshall worked within whatever system confronted him, sometimes seeking to reform it, but never to overthrow it. And by the way, there is evidence in what we read that Marshall was touched, really impressed by certain military scenes. Consider that at V.M.I., when Marshall attended, cadets did not automatically get a second lieutenant's commission. You had to get permission from representatives in Washington to sit for the officer's exam. At that time, only West Point assured an automatic second lieutenant's commission. Yet Marshall vividly remembered how impressed he was when, arriving late, as he mentioned, he saw the entire cadet corps on parade. And further, in 1898, while he was at home in Uniontown during the summer, he saw a regiment of soldiers from the Spanish-American War march through his town. The city had painted the sidewalks through that town red, white, and blue. Red, white, and blue bunting draped every building. Marshall described it as a very great day. Now, when did he get that soldierly spirit? It's hard to pinpoint, but that idea was surely sinking in by the time he was halfway through V.M.I. In other ways, Marshall began to thrive at V.M.I. Because of his bout with typhoid, he promised his mother that he wouldn't go out for football for his first 2 years. And during his third year, a promising season had to be closed down because of an on-post typhoid breakout of that dreaded and debilitating disease. In fact, it was so serious that for the first time, V.M.I. constructed a hospital on post. But senior year, as a first, Marshall played well as a left tackle, enough so that his name made the local newspaper several times. There had to have been developed in him a certain sense of belonging by that time. Marshall remembered that when his team arrived back in town after defeating the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, or VPI, in a close and hard-fought game, and thereby securing a championship, there was a parade from the train station to the post, and it was led by a band with skyrockets and torches and the whole corps marching behind. Always interested in the outdoors and exercise, Marshall talked his roommates into hiking with him to the top of a nearby 3,000-foot house mountain. But he required them to march at regulation infantry step and marching cadence the whole time without a single stop in the round trip. And as he later commented, it took weeks for the blisters to heal. Toward the end of his third year at V.M.I., Marshall also fell in love. Her name was Lily Coles, and she lived in a house very near V.M.I.'s limit gates. As he walked by her house, he heard her playing the piano quite beautifully. The windows on her front porch were deep, so he could see this stunning auburn-haired young woman as she played. He soon figured a way to introduce himself, and it wasn't long after that, as he would later say, that they became steadies. They would marry soon after he graduated. Well, by his senior year, Marshall had thrived indeed. He held the highest rank that could be afforded a V.M.I. cadet. He was the first captain. Photographs of him during this period show him ramrod straight, serious, and also very handsome. He remarked to his biographer again that achieving this rank was something his brother did not do. I feel certain that he couldn't have imagined that 50 years hence a newly built barracks would be named for him, and that to honor the event, the entire post would celebrate what came to be known as Marshall Day. Later, a statue of him would stand stately at the entrance to the barracks. But his development as a famous general was a long way off that last year at V.M.I. In fact, he got his first little test of leadership as a challenge during a mess hall meal with these cadets. Now, for every meal, the cadets had to eat fast, and if you can imagine, at attention. But they had at least a short window of time to socialize, which was a very important time in this very restricted environment. Now, this particular challenge to Marshall's leadership developed as the cadets were having a rare treat of fresh strawberries. And here's the backstory. It seems that there had been a recent case at West Point when the Academy Corps had given complete silence to a tactical officer. In a setting when talk was allowed, every one of them went silent. And this was considered a worse offense than being too loud or boisterous, since it was a means of ridiculing or mocking authority. Now it seemed these V.M.I. cadets had heard about this, and they were putting their leader to the test by doing exactly the same thing. So utter silence fell upon the group, and Marshall figured out exactly what they were doing. He got them up, called them to attention, and marched them out of the mess hall when the strawberries were 1/3 eaten. Without losing his temper, Marshall regained control, he punished the guilty, and he ended the incident without any further reproaches. There is no doubt that something was beginning to click for Marshall at V.M.I., and of his experiences there, he would say, "What I learned at V.M.I. was self-control and discipline so that it was ground in. I learned about the problems of managing men which fell to the cadet officer. He, this first captain, was very seriously judged by his classmates if he was slack. In my job as first captain, I had to exercise authority all of the time, and I had to do it in such a way that it did not create resentment." Because we always get the sense that Marshall perhaps walked in his brother's shadow, there is a letter to him in Volume 1 of the Marshall Papers that particularly interested me. Now, this letter is dated in March of 1914. It was written a good while after he had graduated from V.M.I. and was on duty in the Philippines for his second tour of duty. It's very cordial in tone, by the way. Through a series of circumstances, Marshall, even as a first lieutenant, had become the chief of staff involved in what came to be known as the Batangas maneuvers. And in this elaborate exercise between these designated white and brown armies, Marshall was both the planner and the commander of an invasion force of 4,800 men. And later, his work on this maneuver was hyped as extraordinary, almost mythic. So what interested me about this was how he wrote Stuart this very long and involved letter explaining all that he had done to pull off the victory in this elaborate set of maneuvers. He even enclosed a map to help his brother in understanding. The language is very dramatic. He wrote, "You can imagine the difficulty of landing on the beach, all of the animals and impediments concerned." Or, he continues, "I had practically the whole burden." Or, "There were no restrictions on the campaign except as to real bullets. It included the listing of supplies, obstacles, water hazards, and weather. But perhaps most important, it notes the fact that his team, the whites, has smashed up the infantry of the opposing team." It's even more interesting how he wraps up this story of this, quote, rare opportunity that he had been given. He says, "I trust that you will read this to yourself and then tear it up and disabuse your mind of the idea that I'm rather a remarkable braggart. I don't tell you things about myself, my successes, but this one was rather unique and unheard of during peace times. So I thought it should prove an exception to my usual rule. I do think it felt good for Marshall to tell his older sibling in this so-called rare instance, 'Your younger brother rocked it.'" Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I have to believe that 3 relationships of Marshall's youth, that of his kind mother, his demanding father, and his overachieving and judgmental brother, ended up being a rich combination of motivation for this young man who would become so successful. I wanted to tell you one more story taken from Marshall's life. Not long after his 78th birthday, while he was at his winter home in Pinehurst, North Carolina, with his second wife, Catherine, he had a stroke. Now, this story involves Rose Page Wilson. In the early 1920s, George Marshall was in Washington, and he was working as an aide to General John J. Pershing. He and Lily lived in an apartment in the city, and during that time, the two of them had become very close to Rose Page, a precocious child who lived with her family in the same apartment complex. She became like a daughter to them, perhaps especially because they had no children of their own. After Lily's death, Marshall kept in touch with her. Well, let's fast forward to early 1959. Rose was married, and she had a family of her own. She lived in Durham, North Carolina, not far from Pinehurst, North Carolina, where the Marshalls had spent their winters. After that stroke, Marshall had convalesced at home there. Soon, there were more serious strokes, and Marshall would spend the last months of his life in Washington at Walter Reed. But before that, while he was still at Pinehurst, Rose would drive the 75 miles about every 10 days to spend time with General Marshall. Catherine, who was deeply involved in her husband's care, would have some time to slip away for errands or to see her friends. And although he was weak, Marshall would regale Rose with stories, not of his exploits as a general or statesman, but rather his memories of Uniontown. He was animated as he remembered scenes from that childhood, especially tobogganing on certain hills in the snowy Pennsylvania winters. It prompted Rose to remark that she was sorry that his father hadn't lived long enough to see what a great son he had reared. He would have been very proud of you, she told them. Do you really think so? He asked, quite sincerely. And she laughed at his silly question. But then he added, almost wistfully, I like to believe he would have approved of me. I think you can easily say that he would have been proud of the man that he and his mother had helped shape. I hope you have enjoyed these memories from Marshall's childhood and youth.